So good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk very briefly. This is an extremely large project, but going to try to summarize what this study has been doing over the past few years very quickly. So it's a project that I'm conducting with communities, affected communities, and faculty and environmental justice organizations, health agencies, health professionals, and students to address environmental racism in both Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities throughout Nova Scotia. And I'll define environmental racism a little bit later. So the project is entitled the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities and Community Health Project, and the acronym is ENRICH. And it's a project that I've been conducting since the spring of 2012. It is, as I mentioned, a community-based participatory action research project that's collaborative, it's interdisciplinary, and it's investigating both the socio-economic and the health effects of environmental racism in the communities I just mentioned. So since 2012, we've engaged in a number of activities to create awareness about environmental racism in Nova Scotia, to educate the general public and to educate students, to build capacity in Mi'kmaq communities and African Nova Scotian communities, to create legislation, to build student skills, and to, of course, conduct research. Very quickly, some of these activities have been developing a multidisciplinary team comprised of faculty and researchers across disciplines, community members, specifically African Nova Scotian and Mi'kmaq communities and allies as well, student volunteers, nonprofit agencies, and environmental professionals. We've hosted a series of community workshops in 2013 and 2014 to meet with the community. So we went down to Mi'kmaq communities and African Nova Scotian communities throughout 2013 and 2014 to hear their concerns and how they would like the project to proceed, some of the questions that we need to ask, and some of the objectives that should be guiding the research project. After hosting the series of workshops, we created a documentary film, a 30-minute documentary film, which presents the voices of these communities discussing some of the concerns that they have. We also met with government officials, about 15 government officials at the end of 2014 to determine how government specifically and Nova Scotia environment could address some of these concerns. We're also engaged currently in capacity building, going to communities and building their capacity around water testing specifically. So all of the communities had concerns about soil and water, soil contaminants, water contaminants. So how do we go into the communities then and build their capacity to test their own water, since they are very suspicious of government, particularly having government test their water. So they have mentioned to us that they want to do that independent of government. Of course, much of this project is about training students. There's a lack of knowledge about environmental racism in Nova Scotia. Environmental justice is certainly much more discussed, but environmental racism is a branch off of that tree that I feel that people are not too aware of. So I'm trying to build student skills so they have awareness about this issue. In 2014, we also coordinated an art and youth project. It was called Time to Clear the Air, Art on Environmental Racism by Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian Communities. It's the notion that we need to create awareness in youth, in kids, first off, to appreciate the environment, but also to start discussing the issue with their peers. So the purpose of this art and education project was to mobilize youth around the issue, engage them in creating art, different forms of art to express different instances of environmental racism in their community, submit that art. We showcased the art online through Facebook and Instagram, and there was a kind of a winner at the end of it. But it was really about how do we get youth talking about this particular problem. We also continue to host public engagement events at the library, on campus, anywhere that we can to create awareness. So I would say every year we hold about 3 public engagement events, specifically for people who have never heard about this issue. And I think that's been very successful because through those events, I often get people contacting me saying, how do I get involved? Those events, although they seem benign, it's just an event, it's actually been crucial for the project because I get hordes of people emailing me saying, I want to be involved in this. And these are allies, not necessarily the affected communities. And then, which I'll talk about later, in 2015, in January, I met with an MLA by the name of Lenore Zan to talk about developing a bill, the bill called Bill 111 to address environmental racism. So what is environmental racism? Usually when I'm asked to define environmental racism, I say that there are three components of environmental racism. First is the disproportionate location of polluting industries and other environmental harms in communities of color and Indigenous communities. So specifically, I'm looking at, as I mentioned, Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia and African Nova Scotian communities. So it's this notion that these communities are unequally, unjustly burdened by environmental hazards, and that has a lot to do with policy making and decision making at the government level, specifically in Nova Scotia at Nova Scotia Environment. Environmental racism is also about lack of power. The lack of power that these communities have for resisting against the siting of these industries and other environmental activities. So if you are both low income and you are Indigenous and racialized, specifically in Nova Scotia, you often make up that powerful group, because when you look at issues of class and you look at issues of race and you look at how those two issues intersect, you're even more powerless, right? So you don't have the resources, you may not have the skills, you certainly don't have the political clout to fight back against government. So that's a second very important component of environmental racism. And then when I think about the first panel, they talked a little bit about this in terms of garbage disposal. It's also about the uneven impacts of environmental policies, right? And often what results from the uneven impacts of environmental policies is that there's a lack of monitoring, there's a lack of regulation, and there's a lack of access to waste disposal, cleanup, garbage cleanup, and other resources that can create a sustainable community. So those are the three most important aspects of environmental racism. What are some examples of environmental racism in Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities? I'll talk very briefly about it, but Doreen and Annie Claire will discuss it in more detail. So I think right now of Spitnaktek, band of Mi'kmaq First Nation. 8 years ago, Alton Gas applied to Nova Scotia government to implement a project that would allow natural gas to be stored in underground salt caverns near the Shubenacadie River. This is certainly a socioeconomic and health issue because it will endanger the health and well-being of the Mi'kmaq community. And for over the past few years, the community has banded together to resist this particular issue. So you'll hear more about that later. I also think about Pictou Landing First Nation. Boat Harbor, which is near Pictou Landing First Nation, a native reserve, was once a fertile hunting and fishing ground, as well as a sacred burial ground, until Northern Pulp Mill built an effluent pipeline that has been dumping wastewater into Boat Harbor since 1967. And there are horrific stories about the health impacts of that. I spoke with community members talking about kind of the visible manifestation of illness on the bodies of Mi'kmaq people, skin rashes, etc. So that's very much a historical but present day issue. If I think to the African Nova Scotian community, I think specifically of Lincolnville. In 1974, a first-generation landfill was opened 1 kilometer away from the African Nova Scotian community of Lincolnville. Then in 2006, they removed that landfill but placed another landfill right on the site of the old dump. Of course, community members are concerned with water contamination, soil contamination, and health issues, primarily cancer. I also think of the African Nova Scotian communities of North Preston and East Preston, both of which share a dump. So the health effects of environmental racism is something that's of interest to me because I'm primarily a health researcher. And the term that we use to define or refer to the disproportionate health impacts of environmental racism is environmental health inequities. So this refers to the disproportionate health risks in communities that are disproportionately burdened by environmental hazards. And if you look at the Canadian studies over the past few years, you will see that there's elevated risk of a number of diseases in Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities, including, certainly, most significantly, cancer, asthma, skin rashes, upper respiratory disease, growth retardation, fetal anomalies, cardiovascular disease, and other kinds of allergies. Something I'm also interested in is the psychological impact, the psychological distress of knowing that you live near to these sites and always being afraid to drink the water, which was kind of vocalized to me by the individuals in Lincolnville who talked about just the stress of knowing that you live near to one of these sites and being fearful of drinking the water. So most studies are not looking at the psychological impacts, but if we're to look at health from a holistic perspective, then we have to understand the spiritual, emotional, psychological, mental, and physical impacts of environmental racism. So what is the ENRICH project trying to do? This is a very difficult issue. Thankfully, I have people on board from different fields, geography and environmental studies and sociology, et cetera, who are banding together with me to address this problem. But it's a very difficult issue, but we're trying to make inroads in various ways. First off, I will say that it's important to have an environmental justice equity framework, and people know that. But because I'm specifically interested in racism, I believe that the environmental justice equity framework has to speak specifically to the issue of race. Why? Because racialized groups and Indigenous groups are disproportionately burdened by this issue. So thus far in Nova Scotia, what I'm seeing is people are quite comfortable talking about environmental justice, and they basically know what that means, but they're not applying a race analysis to this particular issue, not acknowledging and validating that certain communities are disproportionately impacted, perhaps because they're focusing too much on malicious intent. There's too much focus on individual acts of maliciousness, so kind of this disbelief. Why would somebody purposely do that to the Mi'kmaq community? You're suggesting that people are malicious. We need to move away from individual intentionality and look at systemic processes, not just the issue of environmental racism, but contextualize it within the historical inequities and processes in Nova Scotia to understand fully the ways in which environmental racism manifests and plays out in our socio-historical context. Environmental racism legislation, that's something that my team has been trying to look at. Having an environmental justice framework is great, but I think it needs to move towards an environmental racism legislation. And this is about many things. But if you create environmental racism legislation, you do many things. You increase awareness about the issue of racism. You bring attention to the issue of racism by government and by the general public. You also simultaneously recognize Aboriginal treaty rights when addressing environmental racism, and you also provide a review of the environmental impact assessment process in collaboration with Indigenous and African Nova Scotian communities. One of the main complaints is that government cites these industries in specific places, but they don't do any consultations, not meaningful anyhow. Government would certainly say that, yes, we did do the consultations, we did it last year, and communities would say, yeah, but you didn't involve us right at the get-go. You didn't involve us at the beginning. So looking at how the environmental or the EA and approval process happens or evolves, and how you engage Indigenous and African Nova Scotian communities at the get-go. Solidarity building. Building bridges between Indigenous and racialized communities and white allies. So I would say that we need to problematize the question of solidarity, because it separates issues, as if Indigenous issues are distinctly separate from migration issues, from issues around temporary foreign workers, from issues around violence against women. We have to find that central issue or problem that we all share. And I feel in Nova Scotia, I think, I'm not from Nova Scotia, but you know, when I went to Nova Scotia for the first time, I felt this is a very segregated place, and Halifax is very segregated, and everybody's in their own little clique. And for a project like this to work, people have to build bridges. So I think focusing on your specific community is important, because your community has a different history. Your community has a different experience of that history. But when race is central, you find those things that all communities share. And when I think of the African Nova Scotian community and the Mi'kmaq community, they share a history of oppression. They share a history of racism. They share a history of lack of political clout. There are many things that they share, and I think building bridges means that you start from that central place. Therefore, there needs to be a centering of and support for Indigenous resurgences, and a shift from a one-dimensional to a relational approach to settler colonial analysis that is connected to the issue of others. Public participation and consultation about the environmental assessment process, which I explained briefly earlier. I would say that given that both Indigenous and African Nova Scotian communities have felt considerably excluded from the environmental assessment process, this suggests to me that a more flexible system of public participation must be instituted by government to ensure that there is clear communication by the proponents, a clear understanding of the EA process by residents, and a full opportunity for residents to participate in decision-making processes related to EAs. What is the project currently doing? We're doing research, of course, community-based research, focus groups, allowing community members to conduct the focus groups. So because it's community-based participatory action, I'm not personally conducting those focus groups, but I hired community members from those regions to do the focus groups because initially they also constructed the research objectives and questions. I'm also hoping that I'll be funded for a new project to look at the EA process, the environmental assessment process. As it stands currently, it's not focused sufficiently on the social, human, and health impacts. So I'm specifically interested in the social determinants of health. How do you incorporate the social determinants of health, the social, economic, political factors that impact our health in the EA process? Community capacity building, trying to build capacity in communities. So specifically with the African Nova Scotian community of Lincolnville. This is the dump in Lincolnville, the landfill, sorry. I mentioned that communities are suspicious of government, of course. How do we get the community themselves to test their own water? There's a volunteer program that was quite successful that enabled community members to test their own water, so we're trying that out. So I've got a geologist and a chemist. We've all gone up to the communities, listened to the community concerns, and they've told us that yes, we would like to be able to test our own water. So we've selected about 10 homes initially to build capacity to do that. If that project works, then we're going to apply that project in other areas. Bill 111, I have 2 more minutes. Bill 111, as I mentioned earlier, I met with MLA Lenore Zan in January of 2015 to look at environmental racism, how we can address it through legislation. We developed Bill 111, an act to address environmental racism, the first bill to address environmental racism in Canada. The objective, to consult, because this is one of the main concerns of communities, no consultation. So what is it? To consult and meet with the Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities. The bill was introduced in April of 2015, put forward to second reading and debated at the House of Assembly in November of 2015. Thus far, still waiting to be approved because, of course, this is a very political, controversial issue. In the meantime, in case that bill doesn't pass, I'm looking at an environmental bill of rights with ECLAW, the East Coast Environmental Law Association, the executive director sitting right there. We're looking at how we can make, while the environmental bill of rights is not about racism, I would like to be involved to ensure that racism is a central aspect of that bill. So while we're waiting for Bill 111 to pass, which may not happen, creating environmental bill of rights where we give all Nova Scotians the right to clean air, water, and land is important, but also making sure that the issue of race is central and the issues that are of concern to Mi'kmaq and African communities are highlighted. What does this do, an environmental bill of rights? It provides whistleblower protection for Nova Scotians who report environmental crimes. It improves government accountability by giving Nova Scotians the right to bring the province to court when it fails to implement its environmental laws. Under most environmental bill of rights, members of the public would have increased access to environmental information as well as the ability to challenge government decisions regarding the environment, not only in court, but ideally in front of an independent tribunal. And finally, increased access to environmental information allows citizens to better inform themselves about environmental decision-making and ultimately whether something should be challenged.